The groom stood in shadow while the bride danced in gold. The music of the Tudor court flowed through the great hall of Hampton Court, silken and hollow. He watched her laugh, his name caught in her throat like a sin. Her gown shimmered like spilled honey beneath the torchlight. She was not his yet. Not truly. But they had already crossed a line that could not be unmade. Thomas Culpeper had been born into privilege, but not power. As a boy, he was sharp-eyed and careful, learning early to listen rather than speak. His older brothers fought loudly for titles and land. Thomas learned something more dangerous. He learned charm. With it, he could slip behind defenses that swords could never breach. His mother doted on him but kept her distance, as though she feared what affection might awaken in him. His father died early, and no one mourned him deeply. Thomas remembered only the cold press of ceremonial gloves and the way his uncle whispered that power must be earned quietly, behind curtains, not on battlefields. By the time Thomas reached court, he had mastered the art of smiling without showing his thoughts. His beauty was not fierce but soft, with a face that made women linger and men mistrust their own wives. It was that face that first caught her attention. Catherine Howard. Cousin to the Queen who had died without a head. A girl of laughter and silk, but reckless in the way fire dances too near drapes. She had been groomed for charm, trained in deceit. But in Thomas, she found a mirror. Not a lover, at first, but a reflection of all the dangerous softness in herself. Their courtship was a thing of sidelong glances and fleeting touches, all cloaked beneath the dull gaze of King Henry. A king grown grotesque with age, whose wounds would not heal and whose heart had soured. Catherine had married him not for love, but for the glitter of the crown. Thomas was what came after. He was what she remembered when the king's breath choked her in the dark. But Thomas, he wanted more than secret moments. He wanted her. Entirely. And in that wanting, something in him changed. He was not content to remain a shadow lover. He began writing her notes. Not courtly poems or cryptic riddles. Direct letters. Desperate ones. There was no coyness left in him. His hands trembled as he wrote them. He believed in something more now. Love, perhaps. Or vengeance disguised as love. But to love the Queen was not only sin. It was treason. And in the folds of the royal bedchamber, the trap had already begun to spring. Before Thomas had ever touched her hand in darkness, he had already been watched. The Tudor court did not sleep. It rustled and whispered, eyes lurking behind tapestries and ears pressed to doors painted in gold. The Queen's favor was a dangerous currency, and Thomas had spent freely. Catherine Howard had come from nothing, daughter of a disgraced Howard, raised in a house where guardians turned blind eyes to the lessons of lust. Her girlhood had been a collage of shadows and rumors. At 13, she had already learned that survival meant smiling while retreating inward. That men only gave if you gave more. That silence was safer than truth. Thomas should have seen this in her. Perhaps he did. But he thought himself different. He believed his love might redeem her, that he was not like the others. He did not just want her body, he wanted to rescue the girl who had been used and discarded. That belief, that hunger to be a savior, would destroy them both. He had been close to the king once. A gentleman of the privy chamber. Trusted. Admitted to the king's most vulnerable hours. He had seen the sores on Henry's leg, heard the agony in his voice, the madness gathering behind his eyes like thunderclouds. Thomas had pitied him. Then he had envied him. Then he had betrayed him. Their secret meetings were not frequent. That was their mistake. Passion is not proof. What condemned Thomas were not touches or kisses, it was the intention to sin. The letters, the rumors, the single night they may or may not have shared. That was enough. But before the arrest, before the interrogations, there was one night Thomas would remember until the axe fell. They met in her chambers. It was late. The ladies had been dismissed. The corridor had been watched, but carelessly. The door clicked shut behind him. She did not speak. She only looked at him, something like fear, or fury, or guilt, buried in her eyes. He moved toward her, and she backed away, as if unsure whether he was love or doom. "I am yours," he whispered. Not a declaration. A plea. But she never answered. Not in words. In that silence, something in Thomas shifted. The boy who had once watched quietly from the corners of court no longer existed. In his place stood a man willing to wager everything for a woman he did not fully understand. And then came the knock. It would be weeks before the true horror began. But in that moment, two hearts halting in the dark, fate had already turned. No royal guards. Not yet. Just a single servant, delivering a message. A whisper of suspicion. A warning. Still, Thomas knew. They had been seen. Or worse, suspected. And suspicion in Henry's court was as fatal as proof. From that night forward, their meetings ceased. But the damage had been done. The letters, retrieved and unburned. The chambermaid who had turned. The cold stares from men who once called him friend. The king's smile, thinner than parchment. Thomas still held hope. Perhaps the king would believe it was all rumor. Perhaps the queen would protect him. Perhaps love, however misguided, could still be forgiven. But the king who had loved Catherine had long since died. In his place stood something else. The man who had executed 2 wives already had no mercy left in him. The Tower of London did not echo. It absorbed sound. Every scream, every whisper, was swallowed into stone. Thomas Culpeper sat alone in his cell, and the silence became a second skin. He had once been surrounded by silk and scent and the soft footfall of women. Now he sat with rats and shadows, waiting for his name to become a public curse. The interrogations came swiftly. Courtiers in velvet with knives in their smiles. They did not ask questions. They issued instructions. Confess. Protect the queen, and your death might be merciful. Betray her, and you might still feel the axe instead of the rope. But if you lied, if you dared lie, you would find out how little mercy meant to a king who had already buried too many wives. Thomas wrote what they demanded. He admitted to loving Catherine. Admitted to visiting her chambers. But insisted, to the last, that he had not taken what belonged to the king. He clung to that one detail like a drowning man grips driftwood. It was not honor. It was strategy. The difference between treason and adultery was the difference between a clean death and something far worse. Elsewhere, Catherine was also breaking. She had denied everything. At first. Loudly. Repeatedly. Then the names were read to her. Francis Derham. Her old lover, now turned evidence. Ladies in waiting who remembered too much. Servants who had seen too little and spoken too often. The noose tightened, and Catherine cracked. She confessed. But not to Thomas. Not directly. She confessed to what had come before the crown. The nights in her youth. The letters. the affection. She tried to draw a line between past sins and present innocence. But in a court that demanded purity, there was no such line. Thomas never saw her again. Not after the arrest. He heard only rumors, how she screamed when she was told of his fate. How she ran in circles inside her chamber, how she begged for one more hour to live. It was a grotesque sort of comfort. If she wept for him, perhaps it had been real. Perhaps it had all meant something. But when Thomas closed his eyes at night, he did not see her crying. He saw her smiling. The way she had smiled at the king. The way she had smiled at other men. The way she had smiled at him, even as the walls began to close in. That smile had destroyed more than his reputation. It had ruined the only thing he had left, his belief that love was enough. The day before his execution, they let him speak to a priest. He confessed again. Not to his crimes, but to something deeper. That he had once believed he could outmaneuver fate. That he had imagined himself cleverer than history. The priest asked if he regretted loving the queen. Thomas said nothing. The execution was held early in the morning. The crowd was already gathered before the light had properly risen. Heads bowed not in reverence, but in hunger. The scent of blood was always strongest in the hours before dawn. He walked to the scaffold without protest. He was 27. They let him speak. He thanked the king for his mercy. He admitted to sin. But not treason. Never that. The axe was sharp. It only needed one stroke. The crowd scattered quickly after. Rain began to fall before they had even removed his body. And somewhere, far above, behind locked doors and veils of silk, the queen waited for the knock on her own door. It would come. Catherine Howard had once danced with the grace of a girl who believed the world existed only to adore her. But in the days after Thomas Culpeper's execution, she no longer danced. She no longer walked, spoke, or wept. She simply existed, curled in her chamber like a forgotten gown, still beautiful, still young, and entirely broken. The court moved on without her. Invitations continued. Foreign envoys still arrived. Henry VIII, though slower and heavier, still played king. But beneath the gilded mask of state, there was rot. And the stench of Catherine's fall infected everything it touched. She was not imprisoned in the Tower. Not at first. That would come later. They kept her confined at Sion House, a place meant for quiet reflection. But her reflection was anything but quiet. Witnesses said she screamed through the night. Others said she prayed. Still others said she simply stared at nothing for hours. When the formal charges arrived, adultery, treason, betrayal of the crown, she did not resist. She asked only for time. Time to prepare. Time to breathe. Time to remember. But time had always been her enemy. Thomas had died on December 10th. She was told of his death not by letter, not by servant, but by the silence that followed his name. No one dared speak of him again. As if by forgetting him, she might be cleansed. But Catherine could not forget. She had been raised without tenderness. Her childhood was a parade of borrowed beds, distant relatives, and the soft press of hands she never wanted. By the time she came to court, she knew how to smile before she learned how to read. She knew how to please, but not how to trust. Thomas had seemed different. For a while. Until he wasn't. In truth, she did not know whether she loved him. Perhaps she had simply seen in him a mirror of her own desperation. A man who wanted to be chosen, A man who would risk everything just to feel seen. And perhaps, for one moment, they had both believed that their love could rewrite the brutal lines of Tudor fate. But love, in Henry's world, was never safe. When they finally brought her to the tower, it was as though the walls sighed in recognition. Another queen. Another downfall. The stones had heard it all before. She passed the spot wherein Boleyn had met her end. Her cousin. The queen who had given birth to a girl, and for it, paid in blood. Catherine paused there, only briefly. Then kept walking. Her execution was set for February 13th. They gave her one mercy. She was allowed to practice. The night before, she was granted a wooden block. She knelt. Again and again. Rehearsing her death like a schoolgirl repeating lessons. Witnesses said she did so calmly. That she held her head with strange dignity. That she whispered Thomas's name. Just once. But no one could say for sure. When the day came, she wore a black velvet robe. Her hair was tucked beneath a linen coif. She looked smaller than anyone remembered. Not a queen. Not even a woman. Just a girl who had loved too late and lied too poorly. She spoke briefly. She asked for forgiveness. She acknowledged her sins. She prayed for the king. And then she knelt. The executioner raised the axe. It fell. And silence returned. The crowd dispersed slowly, less out of reverence than disbelief. 2 young lives had been extinguished, not in the chaos of war or plague, but by love, or the illusion of it. London absorbed it like ash. Another queen dead. Another name blackened. Another whisper that the crown cursed everyone who touched it. But the story did not end with the fall of the axe. After Catherine Howard's execution, Thomas Culpeper's name became a poison. No ballads were sung for him. No monuments raised. His family never reclaimed what was lost. His letters, once trembling with desire, were filed away among state secrets, evidence in a case of royal ruin. For decades, he was remembered only as a seducer. A traitor. A fool. The man who dared to covet the king's wife. Yet buried beneath those accusations lay something more human and far more unsettling. He had not been born cruel. He had not hungered for power. He had not plotted to betray his king. He had simply loved, recklessly, selfishly, blindly. But in Henry's England, love was a treasonous act. And what of Catherine? History was less kind. She was mocked as a wanton, dismissed as shallow, remembered for the echo of Anne Boleyn but not her substance. Yet those who looked closely, who read between the lines of confession and execution, saw something else. A girl raised in silence and shadows. Taught to survive, never to feel. And in Thomas Culpeper, perhaps, she saw the first man who saw her as more than ornament. Perhaps that is why she smiled when he entered her chamber. Perhaps that is why she broke when he died. But even that is only half the truth. Thomas was not just her lover. He was her reflection. A man desperate to matter. To be chosen. To be remembered. And he was remembered, not for what he did, but for what he dared feel. In a court that worshipped control, feeling anything too deeply was the most dangerous crime of all. Historians would later debate the details. Did they consummate their affair? Did they plan to escape? Did she truly love him, or was he only a convenient vessel for rebellion? But the truth lies somewhere deeper. Beneath the documented charges and signed confessions. In the brief, flickering moment when two souls collided in a palace that had already marked them for death. They were not heroes. They were not victims. They were human. And that is what made them dangerous. Had Thomas Culpeper lived longer, what might he have become? A courtier cloaked in regret. A man forever haunted by a queen's final breath. Or worse, a man who forgot, who moved on, who became something cold and clever and empty. Perhaps it is better that he died young. Before bitterness replaced longing. Before the fire of emotion cooled into calculation. Before love curdled into resentment. And Catherine, what might she have become, if her past had not clung to her like a curse? If she had not been married to a dying king, if she had not been raised in a house of whispers, if she had been taught that her worth was not in her smile, but in her soul. But history offers no rewrites. Only questions. What if love had been enough? What if the king had looked at her and seen a frightened child? What if we have always been wrong about Thomas Culpeper? They said he died for lust. But perhaps he died for longing. And perhaps that is far more terrifying.